Speaking of liberty, the National Broadcasting Company presents the first of a new series of programs under the auspices of the Council for Democracy with Rex Stout, distinguished writer and brain parent of the equally distinguished Nero Wolfe, in the interlocutor's chair. Mr. Stout.
Thank you, Mullencross, and good evening to all good friends of liberty, and enemies, if any. Leave it on, it'll do you good. By way of introducing this new program, I'd like to remind you of a fine old American institution which has all but disappeared, the American Cracker Barrel, center of the forum in every crossroads store, sign and symbol of free speech and free discussion. Around the Cracker Barrel, every man was free to say what he thought and felt, to swap opinions with his neighbors, and to change his mind, if he ever did, only when he couldn't think of another comeback. I'd like to think of these talks we're going to have as a sort of Cracker Barrel of the air, with all kinds of people, authors, journalists, critics, foreign correspondents, swapping ideas, and telling us things that sometimes don't get into their books and articles. We hope and believe that what they say will have significance and value to all of us who want to keep the democracy we've got and who are determined to get more of it instead of less. It took brave and stubborn men to get it, and it takes brave and stubborn men to keep it, defend it, and expand it. We want on this program to remind you of pages of its glorious history that you knew but have forgotten, to tell you of recently discovered pages that you've never read, to unmask the enemies and expose the dangers that confront it today, to sing again its poetry and wave its flag. Our guest this evening, who's sitting here at the table with me now, is Charles Van Doren, critic, biographer, and historian of our country and the people who built it. Also, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner for his biography of Benjamin Franklin. Mr. Van Doren, I've been hearing a lot of gossip about this new work of yours, old attics, mysterious papers, secrets locked away in trunks for 100 years. Just what are you doing, and what's it all about?
I'm afraid you've been reading too much Nero Wolfe. No, I'm simply making a special study of certain undercover activities during the American Revolution. Nothing mysterious about it.
But I understand you have a lot of new stuff.
I have. I've been working on the public and private papers of Sir Henry Clinton. You know, the British commander-in-chief.
I've heard his name.
Well, most of his papers were hidden away for 150 years in boxes and pigeonholes in his London house, in his country house. One bundle was even tucked in the seat of his old carriage.
150? Why hidden so long? Didn't anybody know about them?
Oh, nobody bothered his head about them. You see, when Clinton went back to England, he expected to fight his battles over again in print, as old generals will do. And so he kept his papers and his secrets all together for his own use.
Why weren't they called for by the authorities?
Such things are pretty casual in those days, Stout. And there were other things for Englishmen to think about besides the late unfortunate war with America. So the Clinton papers stayed where they were and were neglected. They passed to Clinton's son and then to later descendants. So they were finally bought by the great Michigan collector, William L. Clements.
Where are they now?
In the Clements Library at Ann Arbor, Michigan. You know, if you mean to make any serious study of the American Revolution, sooner or later you must go to Ann Arbor. The Clements Library has material that isn't duplicated anywhere else in the world.
All right. Pass the crackers. Start with the undercover work. Have you found out much that hasn't been generally known?
A great deal more than has been suspected, even by specialists. Please don't think I'm changing the subject. If I ask you if you've ever visited the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum, right here in New York City?
Often. It's my favorite antique shop.
Well, possibly you've noticed one of the rooms, which is taken from the house of a leading Rhode Island patriot during the Revolutionary War, Metcalfe Bowler, who was Chief Justice of the state and who signed the Rhode Island Declaration of Independence.
I believe I have.
One of my Providence correspondents, just a few weeks ago, wrote me that he'd paid a visit to Bowler's grave and then found an American flag flying over it, provided by the Sons of the American Revolution.
And why not?
Because Metcalfe Bowler was a paid spy for Clinton for nearly 3 years. Clinton saved Bowler's letters, and I've read them all. They were printed in a learned journal of small circulation 10 years ago, but have never reached the public, which still thinks Bowler was a great patriot.
Did he get enough out of it to furnish that room at the Metropolitan Museum?
Far from it. He was an appeaser. He was trying to conciliate both sides, and never quite sure which one he was on. And he was a sort of shivering neutral between two fires. If you want to know what happened to him, he stayed among the patriots and suffered with them from the British occupation of Rhode Island, and he got very little money from the British, because he was too inactive an American to have much information to sell. The Hessians damaged his house as much as any patriots. Treachery, that is, didn't pay.
Poor bowler.
Much the same thing happened to Benedict Arnold. He asked for £20,000, which was $100,000. In those days, would be equal to about $500,000 now, to surrender West Point to the British. His offer was accepted, provided the deal went through. He asked for £10,000 if it fell through, as we know it did. What he got was about $6,000, and pensions for himself and his family. But he also got universal dishonor in America and very small honor in England.
Were there many traitors besides Benedict Arnold?
There were so few that it makes you rather proud to go through these old records. Not that the king and his ministers didn't try. They were bribing or otherwise influencing the majority which kept Lord North's ministry in power in England. As the English all felt, it was natural to extend the method to America, if possible. The king was set on a form of personal rule that would have turned the clock of English government back 100 years. That, in part, was why the Americans rebelled. You must remember that for more than a year after Washington took command of the Continental Army, till after the Declaration of Independence, in fact, he always referred to the enemy as the ministerial, not as the British Army. That is, he thought of himself as fighting not the British people, but a reactionary king and a pliant ministry.
Who were some of these patriots the ministry tried to bribe?
Well, Clinton sent a loyalist to try to win Israel Putnam over. Now, I'm giving away a secret that I've never publicly made known. But I'll save that story up for my book. Then agents made attempts on Ethan Allen, the hero of Vermont.
Allen? They actually thought they might bribe Ethan Allen?
That was politics, Stout. See, Vermont was claimed by both New Hampshire and New York and wanted Congress to recognize its independence. George III was particularly interested in Vermont and offered to set it up as a separate province if it would join Canada rather than the United States. So Clinton sent emissaries to Allen.
And what did Allen do? Tell them to go climb a tree in the name of great Jehovah and the Continental Congress?
No. He notified Congress that he had had the office, probably to force Congress to pay some attention to what Vermont wanted. Allen was a rough and ready character, but loyal to Vermont, I think, rather than ever false to America.
I gather from what Oliver Wiswell says that all the American revolutionaries were ready for anything, just so it was rough. And I gather from the same source that the Americans who stood for the king, the royalists, were a composite of all the virtues.
That's what Oliver Wiswell says, and he probably would have thought so at the time. Such thinking was what cost the loyalists their country. They made the mistake of underestimating the patriots. As you might expect, the loyalists included many conservative men and men of family and property and education. But the patriots included such people, too. Washington, nothing of the great men, had half a dozen young aides, all about Wiswell's age, who were better men than Wiswell on almost any count. Look at John Lawrence of South Carolina and Tench Tillman of Maryland and David Humphreys of Connecticut, who was afterwards minister to Spain, and John Trumbull, who became America's great painter of the Revolution, not to mention Alexander Hamilton of New York, who can hardly be called illiterate.
Come to think about it, I have heard more about these fellows than I have about the loyalists. Or for that matter, about the ministers in London who were carrying out the king's policy. Lord North is the only one I could name offhand.
Not much wonder. It was hard for the king to get first-rate ministers. The great English statesmen of the age were most of them opposed to the American policy of the king. Everybody remembers Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox and the Earl of Chatham. And there was Thomas Coke, the richest commoner in England, who insisted that his guests at dinner always drink a toast to General Washington as the greatest man in the world. He named his farms after American victories. They were all pro-American, in a sense.
You mean they were anti-English?
Not at all. They were defending the traditional rights of Englishmen, the English way of life, we might call it now, and they believed the Americans were doing the same thing. That was what the Americans set out to do, and they declared their independence only after they had given up hope of getting the rights of Englishmen under that king and that ministry. The English Whigs and the American Whigs were virtually allies against the Tories, whether English or American. Do you know that after Lexington and Concord, English Friends of America raised £100 by small popular subscriptions and sent it to Franklin for the American widows and orphans that had been made that day? Or do you know that the run of Englishmen felt so little enthusiasm for the war that it was almost impossible to enlist as many soldiers and sailors as were needed?
I suppose that's where the Hessians came in.
Well, you might say that, Stout. The King of England was also Elector of Hanover and saw no reason why he shouldn't use his German subjects to restore order among his American subjects.
Well, if so many Englishmen were friendly to the American Whigs, why did the Revolution last so long?
Partly because so many Americans were friendly to the English Tories. The Revolution was, after all, a civil war in America. At the end of it, something like a third or even more of the men under Clinton's command in the British Army in America were American-born. You see, in both countries there was conflict, military in America, political in Great Britain. The outcome was that we became independent of the British Crown, and so, in a sense, did the British. Since then, Parliament has been supreme, not the king. George III was, if I may strain a term, England's last dictator.
And out in a little schoolhouse in Kansas, I was taught that the war was between England and America, just like that. Now, I'm not sure I know who was fighting whom about what.
Don't worry, you aren't as confused as people then were. Things become clear, if ever, only when time has settled them and history explains them.
But don't you think that understanding the past helps us to understand the present? How about you, Mr. Van Doren? What have you found out in your studies of the Revolution that has some bearing on the questions we face today?
There's that point about confusion, Stout. It's a good idea to realize that confusion is always with us and that we are no more confused now than men have often been. If they came out, so can we. But we can't come out by being compromisers, to pieces if you like, on principle. History will do the compromising for us. We have to stand up for our convictions. Then at least some of us will turn out to be right. The only persons who are sure in advance to be wrong are those who never take any stand but merely wobble, kicked about by both sides, like Metcalfe Bowler. And I think my studies of the Revolution have given me some assurance on the second point.
What's that?
That the Revolution, for all it had many conflicting motives, was fought essentially in the desire to extend more rights to more men, and that it was successful for that very reason. That made more men willing to put more power into it. In the long run, many heads are better than one, and I am convinced democracy is not only the most satisfactory form of government, but the most efficient.
Spread that one out, Carl. That efficient. Of all the belittlers of democracy, the ones who say it is inefficient give me the biggest pain.
Show me a modern democracy that has lasted as long as England or America have under their present form of government, or that shows any prospect of lasting so long, even now, in an age of dictatorships. And show me one from which a large part of the population would not instantly emigrate to America if they could, or even to England in the midst of a terrible war. Democracy, with all its faults, is to government what its level is to water. You dam up water as long as you like, and sooner or later you know what it seeks and finds. So with human life. Dictators can dam it up, but they cannot hold it forever. It will seek and find its democratic level somehow, somewhere. Life has found something like that democratic level in the United States. We can never be forgiven if we do not make every effort to preserve it and extend it and cherish it.
Amen. As they say at Quaker meeting, that friend spoke my mind. Our guest this evening, ladies and gentlemen, on this first Cracker Barrel session of the new Council for Democracy program called Speaking of Liberty, has been Charles Van Doren. Thank you, Mr. Van Doren. This is Rex Stout saying goodbye until next week.
You have just heard the first of a new series of programs entitled Speaking of Liberty, brought to you each Thursday evening at this time by the National Broadcasting Company in cooperation with the Council for Democracy, a national organization dedicated to the propagation of an American faith in democracy. Next week, Rex Stout will bring Edmund Taylor to the microphone. Copy of the script of this broadcast will be mailed free to anyone requesting it. Please address your request by card or letter to the Council for Democracy, 285 Madison Avenue, New York. Speaking of Liberty has been presented as a public service by the NBC and the independent radio stations associated with the Red Network of the National Broadcasting Company.